So good morning, everybody. Today's DYL and today's broadcast is being sponsored by Rav Victor Hyman, L'Zech Nishmas, his grandfather, whose Yosy is today, DYL, Yosy and Abshimon Zechron L'Rocha. Today is also the Yortzeit of Reb Meir Simcha, the Or Sameach. It's his Yortzeit today. And he was a Rav in the city of Dvinsk, and he was the Litvish Rav. And that city also had a Hasidic Rav, who was the Ragachover. I think the Ragachover's last name was Rosen, maybe Rosen or Posen. And there's a famous story with Reb Meir Simcha and the Ragachover. They worked in conjunction with each other because they were both leaders in the same community. And they once had a disagreement on a certain halacha, and they couldn't come to an agreement. They just disagreed. So they decided the best way to get a resolution on who's right is using a klal that the das balabatim is the hepech from das Torah. So they made up that they would ask a balabos and see what he says, and then whatever he would say, they would know that the opposite is true. So they went and asked, I believe they went and asked this balabos, and I hope I'm saying over the story correctly. They went and asked the balabos, and the balabos said exactly like the Ragachover. So Reb Meir Simcha said, you see, so according to our agreement, I'm right, because the balabos said like you. So Reb Meir Simcha said, no. So the Ragachover said, no, because when did we ask this balabos? We asked him on Friday. On Friday, the Gemara tells us that if someone does damage on Friday, sometimes he's potter because everyone's rushing. So the balabos wasn't thinking clearly. So since he wasn't thinking clearly, that's why he said like me. Had he thought clearly, he would have said like you, so the halacha was like me. So that was the ma'aseh that I remember from Reb Meir Simcha. Supposedly, Reb Meir Simcha wrote the Meshech Chochmah on Chumash before he wrote the Or Sameach on the Rambam, and the Meshech Chochmah and Chumash is such an awesome sefer. It's an incredible sefer of machshava on Chumash. And his most famous shtickle is the shtickle where he writes, Ich bin ein Berliner. He writes that when someone considers himself more connected to the host country that he's temporarily in than to Yerushalayim, than to where we belong, that's when we know we're going to be thrown out soon. I believe he made this prediction in the 20s or 30s that there's going to be a Holocaust that's going to wipe out European Jewry because people were feeling more connected and more loyal to the European hosts than they were connected to Klal Yisrael and to Eretz Yisrael. So supposedly after he wrote the Meshech Chochmah, Balabas was so blown away by the Meshech Chochmah that he hired him to write a sefer on the Rambam because of the go'inus that he displayed in his Meshech Chochmah, and supposedly the Balabas was disappointed with the results of the Or Sameach al Rambam because it wasn't as incredible as the Meshech Chochmah. Okay, so we're learning. Everybody learns in Hascholos Gemara when we're in Cheder. We learn about the machloikis between Abyei and Rava by Yiyush Shalom Midas. And we know that normally in Shas we paskin like Rava, but there's 6 cases where we paskin like Abyei. And we know the Gemara tells us that we paskin like Abyei by Ya'al Kigam. And the Yud of Ya'al stands for Yiyush Shalom Midas. So we're learning the Lamed, the Ya'al, the Lamed of the Ya'al. That's what we're learning today. So before we even start the sugya, we should know that the halacha here is going to be like Abyei. So Zok to Gemara, Itmar, Lechi ha'omed me'elav. You had a Lechi that was standing up by itself. How did something stand by itself? Zok to Gemara, ha'omed me'elav, shlehuk v'sham l'shem tikun mavi, delohizm ne'lekach. So there happened to have been something that its physical properties would function exactly like a Lechi would at the opening of a mavi, but no one prepared it. For instance, imagine a small tree grew right near the edge of the mavli, which could technically function as a lechi, but you didn't put it there as the lechi. It was happened to have grown there on its own. So Abyei Amar have a lechi. That is considered a good lechi. Rav Amar lo have a lechi. Rabbi says not a good lechi. You'd have to plant or put another lechi. If this Shabbos nobody relied on it, Kula Alma loy pligi. Everybody agrees the loy have a lechi. So, for instance, Rashi says, "What does it mean we didn't rely on it for yesterday?" They had already set up a proper lechi for this mavli, but there happened to also to be this secondary lechi. For instance, a tree was there that nobody paid attention to because we had the lechi that the Eruv committee put up, and on Shabbos, for whatever reason, the lechi that the Eruv committee put up fell. It was no longer there. And now we have another lechi. Can we continue to carry in this mavli because of this secondary lechi or not? So Zok to Gemara, there everybody would agree that it's not a good lechi. The question here is, if it's something that yesterday people did rely on, and that was before Shabbos, we wanted to rely on that lechi. But no one placed it there for the purposes of the Erev. So Abyei Amar have a lechi. Abyei says it's a good lechi. Because we've already set it up as the lechi that we're going to use from the day before. Rava says, Lo have a lechi, it's not a good lechi. Kivin de mikara lav adaiti the hachi avidi, since it wasn't originally placed there, this tree grew by itself. Sure, now Erev Shabbos you want to use it as a lechi, but the tree wasn't placed there, wasn't planted there for the lechi. It happened to have grown there, and you said, "Hey, let's take advantage of this." Therefore, lo have a lechi. Zok to Gemara kasol kadaitach. The havamina of the Gemara here is kehechet the pligi bilechi. The same way they argue by a lechi, pligi nami b'mechitza. They also argue by a mechitza. If someone has a mechitza that sort of came by itself, can you rely on it? The Gemara states that because now the Gemara is going to ask a lot of kashas from cases that are mechitzas, not cases that are lechis. The pashut way to understand the machlokes Abyei and Rava is Abyei holds. We learned some controversy. The lechi, is it there only as a heker to indicate the opening of the mavi, or is it also there because it has a mechitza? We learned that according to everybody, there's an element of mechitza and the element of heker. The question is, which is dominant? So Abyei holds the most important thing is the mechitza portion. Therefore, the fact that it's there, who cares if I didn't put it there special? It acts as a mechitza. So even though the heker is weaker, I'll be happy with that. Rava says, no, heker is the most important, and this is an inadequate heker. So Zok Gemara Tashma. You made a sukkah between trees. In other words, the ilanis to fanisla. You're using the trees as the wall. Sheretz kosher. So here you have trees that definitely they grew on their own, and now you want to use them for your sukkah. That's exactly the shaila of Abyei and Rava. So we're not talking about trees that just happened to have been there. Here's a fellow who wanted to make a sukkah out of trees. So he went and planted a row of trees to build for his wall. It was done purposely that way to build a sukkah. There, even Rava agrees that it would be a good wall. If the case is where you planted it explicitly for that purpose, do I need a brisa to tell you a chiddush that that's kosher? Why is it different than any other wall that I would construct? But Gemara, no. The chiddush of the brisa is you're allowed to make walls of a sukkah out of a tree, and you're not geyser that you're not allowed to be mishamish with the tree, because we know you're not allowed to use trees on Shabbos. So you might think if you use them as walls, you might come to hang things on them or use them. Kamash malon that you don't have to worry about it. Zok to worry about it. Tashma hayisham ilan or geder or chitzis hakadu. Here we're talking about pasei birois. We already learned pasei birois were the first Enroute. We know that we have rest areas on the 401 called Enroute. So they had people, the most traveled roads were the roads where people came to be the regal. And they also needed the Enroute. They also needed rest areas where they could refuel their camels and themselves. So they didn't have such an extensive menu as our Enroute, because basically you were able to pick water any way you wanted it. So the problem is a bor Rishus Harabim is going to be a Rishus HaYachid. You can't take water out of a bor. So they would make four corners. They would make walls at the four corners. So four L-shaped walls, and the Chazal were makel that would be considered a mechitza, and therefore you'd be able to carry inside there. You'd be able to take water out of the bor and eat it and drink the water in that rest area. So what if they didn't have specially constructed walls around this bor? Rather, there was a tree, or geder, or some type of wall there. Chitzas hakonim. Chitzas hakonim is a wall that's made out of a whole bunch of vertical reeds. So a whole bunch of vertical reeds that are growing, and they form a wall. Nida mishum diyumid, we can also treat it like the diyumid. The diyumid was the L-shaped wall that was required on each corner. So even if it was there from before, it was a naturally occurring thing, such as a chitzas hakonim, it's considered a good wall. So this indeed proves by his point that a lechi ha'imid me'elov is going to be a good wall, and therefore a good lechi, because now the Gemara equates the two. So Gemara, no, it's not a raya. You would have planted everything, all of these things, Elon, Ged, Chitz HaKonim, were all planted or placed especially for the purposes of the Pasei B'Rois. So this is not called a lechi ha'imid me'elov. If these were especially put there, so what's the chiddush that they serve the purpose of Pasei B'Rois? No one says there's any restriction as to what you can make these walls out of. So tomorrow, Kamash Malon, Chitzas Hakonim, Kana Pachas Muslosh Tvachim. It's telling you a chiddush that this wall made out of reeds, each reed itself is not 3 tvachim. It's a small slat, yet you're placing them vertically within 3 tvachim of each other to say lavud. It's not so pashut to say lavud when each of the pieces are very, very thin. On Daf Yutes Amud Beis, there's a whole sugya about it, whether or not that's considered a good wall, and we'll learn the sugya later on when we get there. But you could say that this brisa here was coming to tell you a chiddush that this wall indeed is a good wall. But there's, again, it's not discussing the shaila of lechi ha'imid me'elov. Tashma, let's try another raya. Ilan ha'meisech ha'laretz. Imagine you have a tree, a large tree, and it has big, wide-spreading branches, and it creates a huge umbrella, and the branches, like some willow trees, the branches, let's say you have your tree in the middle, and the branches could have a radius of 50 feet. These are huge trees, and the branches lean all the way down to the floor all around. So it creates a huge umbrella with a round wall, and the branches can reach the floor. So the Gemara, the Brisa tells us of ein noifai gavoyim in aretz gimel tvachim. If the umbrella of this tree, it's actually called the canopy. If the canopy of this tree reaches all the way to the ground, so we're not talking about the trunk, we're talking about the branches that hang over that form the canopy. If they hang down to within 3 tvachim of the ground, where you could say lavud or good asik, metalton tachtov, you're actually allowed to carry there on Shabbos, even though this might be situated in a Carmelis or Rishus Harabim, the area under the canopy of the tree is considered walled off, and it's considered a Rishus Harabim, a Rishus HaYachid. So again, that tree, you didn't plant for this purpose. That tree is just a naturally occurring tree. It's a lechi ha'imid me'elov. Yet you see in the Brisa that it's considered a mechitza. So Gemara, hachanami b'mayaskinon shenatim mitchil lekach. They actually planted this tree for the express purpose of creating some shade in the field for the people that are working there. So it was actually a tree that was planted for that purpose. So again, it's not relevant to the machlokes of Abyei and Rava. If you specifically planted this tree to create this dwelling out there in the fields, you should be able to carry anywhere in your house. You're allowed to carry anywhere in your house. Yet we find that there's a limitation to how big an area you can carry under with this type of partition, with this tree partition. Alama Omer Rav Huna B'Reid Rabbi Yeshua, Ein metaltalin boy alabei sosayim. You're not allowed to carry. We don't treat it as a Rosh Hashanah the entire area under the canopy of the tree. Rather, we limit it to a maximum size of Beis Hasayim. And the question is why? So Rashi tells us that there's certain type of mechitzas that aren't so good. And because of that, even though technically they create Rosh Hashanah within their perimeter, we limit the size of perimeter that they could be effective for. So let's see Rashi. If its canopy was greater than Beis Hasayim, which is the size of the Chotzar Mishkan, the Chotzar Mishkan, whenever you have a perimeter, but it's not a good perimeter, there's a weakness, there's a chesaron to this perimeter. What are examples of perimeters that aren't really good perimeters? If you have a wall that either has vertical slats or horizontal slats, but it doesn't have both vertical and horizontal, so it's not such a solid wall. That's one example of a wall with weaknesses. Or if you create, like we find when you go up to the farmlands, when you go up north, you always see people have properties that are surrounded by these wooden fences, but no one's living in those fences. They're fenced off to create a perimeter around their property, but no one's, the purpose of the walls there aren't to live in. So that's also considered a deficiency in the wall. For Hakanami, here as well, when we're talking about this tree that made a canopy, there's a deficiency in this wall as well. If it's a lechi amid ma'elav, so then you could say it has a weakness, it has a deficiency, and that's why we limit the perimeter to Beis Hasayim. But if you're going to learn that this Bryce is talking about someone who planted it mitchila, so then it's a wall without any deficiency. If it's a wall without any deficiency, why did the Chum limit the perimeter, the area that it contains, to a maximum of Beis Hasayim? I'll tell you why. The answer is mishum to have a dira shetashmish la'aver. It's because the whole purpose of this dira isn't really to live in. Nobody wants to live there. It's just that there's people who work out in the fields, who are shepherds, who have to be out there. They don't want to be out there, but they have to be out there, so we create some type of shelter for them. Anytime you have a deer that's not really made to live in, rather just made to provide shelter from people who are living out there, who are working out there, that's also limited. And Rashi also gives us a little bit of an elaboration. And he says, it wasn't really made for living inside. The reason why this was made was so that workers can work in the area around the tree. So that people who are the watchmen for the fields, they don't really live there, but they work there, and therefore vasuyin lahatzal minachamo. So this isn't really a bona fide house. It's just a shelter for someone who's working not in the house, but working out of the house. But it's a place where he can go to get some shade. That's considered a compromised, a deficient type of perimeter, and therefore it's limited. Its size is limited to a Beis Hasayim. Tashma.
But Yosy, Lamaisa, it's a naturally grown mechitza.
No, we're learning now that it's speaking where you planted it l'chatchila l'kach. Right? The Gemara says, even if you planted it specifically for that, but since its use is not to be a home, it's still limited. So now we're talking about Tchum Shabbos. So the halach is, if you end up smack in the middle of it, nowhere on Shabbos, so your Tchum is your Daled Amos. All you have is Daled Amos. You're stuck. So Tashma, actually not. You're not stuck. You have Daled Amos, and you have 2,000 Amos from where you are. You are the center of a radius of 2,000 Amos. However, sometimes we can get you a little more space. Tashma, Shavas Batel. What if you found yourself on Shabbos? You stopped on a hilltop, but it's a hilltop that's not very gradual incline, but has a sharp incline. So the four walls of the incline, of the slope to get up to the area that you're on top of, act as a wall. Shehu Gavoya Asar, it's the walls of this hilltop are 10 tvachim high. V'hu me arba amos bad beis hasayim. And the flat area on top is anywhere between 4 amos as a minimum, because less than 4 amos doesn't really help you anything. You have 4 amos anyway, even without being in any area. But it also gives you up to beis hasayim, which means if you find yourself on this place on Shabbos, the halach is your Rishus HaYachid is considered that entire plateau. And from outside that plateau is where you start counting the radius of 2,000 amas for your Tchum of Shabbos. V'chein ben nekah, shahu amuk asar, or if you're in a crevice in a rock that's 10 tvachim deep, uba arba amos, and again, it's within arba amos at beis hasayim, so you have your little enclave there in the rock. Or what if you're in a field? V'kamak tzura v'shiboilos makivus oisa. Or you're in a field where there's a clearing, where there's an area where the plants were cut, but all around you, imagine you're in a cornfield. You can cut off clear a certain area, and then you can be surrounded by 4 walls of corn. So that's also considered Rishus HaYachid. So the halach is mahalachas kula. That's your Rishus. So the entire clearing that you're surrounded with, up to Beis Hasayim, is your area. That's where you are. And v'chutzala alpayim amma, and even out of that area, you have a tchum of 2,000 amas. So you see, these are all walls that were naturally occurring. Nobody made those walls specifically for the purposes of a wall. Rather, you just found it that way, and nevertheless, they considered a wall. If you want to argue that you made it originally that way. So I understand you could have cut down a clearing in the middle of a cornfield to create yourself a space. You can't make yourself a mountain. You can't create an opening in a rock. So you have a raya from here that a mechitza oimid me'elav, in fact, would be a good mechitza, which is a raya to Abyei. So by mechitzos, everybody agrees that even if it stands by itself, it's good to have a mechitza. Keep ligi belechi. The whole machlek is on by lechi. Why is a lechi different than a mechitza? If Aymed Me'elav is not good, it shouldn't be good anywhere, and if it's good, it should be good in both places. So tomorrow I'll tell you why. Abyei tamei, which we discussed a little earlier, nomer lechi mishum mechitza. Abyei, the main purpose of the lechi is because it's mishum mechitza. And therefore, umechitza hasuya me'elah, have a mechitza, as we've illustrated with the last couple of rayas, that a mechitza that shows up by itself, that occurs naturally, is a good mechitza, and therefore Abyei holds it should be good for a lechi as well. For Rav Tamei Damer lechi mishum heker, Rav holds lechi is als heker, and therefore yavida biyadayim, if you made it special for the purposes of being a heker, then have a heker. The Eloi, if it's naturally occurring, loy have a heker, that's not good enough of a heker for Rava, and therefore he holds it's not going to be good. And you always wonder, how do you make this rock? It reminds you of the story, and everyone knows the story, with the 3 elderly Eden that were sitting on the bench on the beach in Miami Beach. And Yankel says, Bedel, Yankel and Chaim say, Bedel, was did du die bist vom Boropark? Was did du in Florida? So die weißt du nicht. Ich hatte eine große Fabrik von cardboard boxes. Ich mache cardboard boxes. Da muss ich das Reife bei mir. Ui, die ganze Fabrik hat sich verbrennt. Sie gewinnen 10 Pfeile, als sie gewinnen dort. Sie gewinnen riesig. Die ganze Boropark hat sich vermacht von dem. In Verfallen, ich bin schon gewinnen ein älterer Jid. Ich soll mich jetzt öffnen eine neue Fabrik. You know how hard it is to set up a new facility. I took the settlement. I got a decent settlement, and I moved here. I retired here. Then they say, Beryl, and wie hast du gekommen? He says, I had a huge factory of clothing. I manufactured clothing. And one day, I don't know what happened. There was a malfunction. The sprinkler system popped, and the entire factory got soaked. The equipment was ruined. The inventory was ruined. It was a disaster. Again, I didn't have koyach to start over again. I took the settlement, and I moved out to Florida. Then they asked Chaim, how did you get here? He says, I used to have a hotel on the Jersey Shore in Asbury Park. And there was a big hurricane. and it wiped my hotel out. I was wiped out. Baruch Hashem, I had hurricane insurance, and I took the settlement. I didn't have koich to start over again. I moved here. So the other two look at him and say, "How do you make a hurricane?" So over here to the Gemara is saying, "How do you make rocks? How do you make these holes? How do you do that?" Zot Gemara weiter. Toshma, Avne Geder Hayoytzois Min Hageder. If you have stones of a fence that are sticking out from each other, the easiest way to illustrate it is with a picture. So if we look here at the picture here, it's basically a wall that we stop building in the middle. So bricks are usually built offset from each other. So every second brick sticks out. So Zok Gemara, what if you had Avne Geder Hayoytzois Min Hageder? Zok Tehele Gemara, Muvdolis Zumizu. There's a separation, of course, between each of these protruding bricks. They're separated by a row of bricks. So the loch is pachas mishloisha. If the distance in between each of these bricks are less than 3 tvachim, we'll look at these bricks sticking out as if they're one post, and therefore ein tzorich lechi acher. If that was the mall of the movi, you would not have to put a lechi there, because those bricks sticking out can act as your lechi. But shloisha, if there's a space of 3 tvachim in between the bricks, so you don't say love it, then tzorich lechi acher, then you would need a second lechi. But I'll call upon him, you see over here, this was built into the bricks. It was there by itself. It wasn't made for the purposes of a lechi, and nevertheless, you see that it's going to work. So this is a raya to Abyei. So we know, when they built it, they actually built it special offset so they can incorporate the lechi of the mavi into the design of the construction of the mavi. So if that's the case, that it was built special, so what is the chiddush of this brisa? So you might say that he didn't really build it to be a lechi. He built it because he one day plans to expand, and he doesn't want to have to start breaking his existing wall to interlock the extension wall with his current wall. So he already created that pattern so that when it comes time to add on to the wall, he'll already have a pattern that can be interlocked with the new wall. But it's not really elechi, kamashlan, that it's good. Tashma, the Tanya Reb Chia, koisel shetzidoi achad konus mechaverei. A koisel that's one wall is a little bit indented from its other one. Now we have this case, and there the article had a picture, so we'll go to the picture, which would make it much simpler and easier to understand. So this was the picture. It's on 9b2 for those who have our scrolls. And there's two options here. There's one option where this koisel, the outer koisel, is a little set back, so it doesn't make a perfect corner. Or this option where the wall from the outside sticks out further, so it doesn't mate to the inner wall of the movi. There's a little corner in there. So these are the two versions, the two options of a koisel that's konus mechavere. So the halach is bein shenir mi b'chutz v'shavah mi b'fnim. Say if you could tell from the outside, but you can't tell from the inside. Uvein shenir mi b'fnim v'shavah mi b'chutz. Say if you could tell from the inside and not from the outside, nidoy mishum lechi, it would have the halach of a lechi. So let's go back to the picture so we get clear. In this particular case, if I'm inside the mavi looking out, I can see this sticking out. So I see this lechi. But if I'm walking down the street and I look, it just looks like an opening in a wall, I can't tell that there's a lechi there. So this is called nir mi b'fnim. If you're looking from the inside out, you could tell that there's a lechi there, but it's ein nir mi b'chutz. This case, if I'm inside and looking out, I don't see any indent here. I just see straight out. But if I'm walking on the outside on the street, when I come in, I could see this indent quite clearly. So this is called nir mi b'chutz v'shava mi b'fnim. So in these two cases, the Brisa tells us that they're both considered lechis. But once again, we have a problem because this is not a specifically built lechi. This is just in the construction, it turned out that way. So it's lechi oibid me'elov. It's still good, so it should be right, Abyei. So tomorrow, no, hakanami she'osam t'chil lekach. You built it specially, so you actually wanted to incorporate it into the design of the wall. In fact, Gemara, what's the chiddush? You built it special that way for the lechi. So tomorrow, that near mi b'chutz, the shava mi b'fnim, nida mishum lechi. And in fact, we had a couple of lot ago that this is a matter of dispute There's a big machloikis if that would be good. So from this brisa, the more wanted to be garaya that near mi b'chutz, v'shava mi b'fnim. If you cannot tell from the inside if there's a lechi, it's still considered a good lechi. Zok more tashma. The Rav have a Yosef bahumavua. Rav was once sitting in a mavi. Have a Yosef Rav Huna kamei, and Rav Huna was sitting in front of it. Rav was thirsty, so Amar le Shama, he told the Shamas, Zil Aisili Kuza Demaya, please bring me a jug of water. Now, before we go on, this mavi was unique because this mavi, of course, had a lechi in it, because of course you wouldn't be able to carry in it, but it also had a little tree growing there that would have fit the description of our sugya of a lechi ha'oimed me'elav. Now, Ada also, by the time the Shamas came back with the jug of water to serve Rav, nofalachya, the lechi that was made for the purposes of the Eruv, the lechi that was put up by the Eruv committee had fallen down. So now you're not allowed to carry in the mavi anymore. So Rav wanted to stop his shamus in his tracks because the shamus may not carry in the mavi. So Akfale biyadei, Rav when the attendant was about to come into the mavi, he held up his hand, stop. And kamaduchte, in fact, the shamus stopped in his tracks so that he shouldn't walk into the mavi, which had lost its tikkun of a lechi. So Amalei Rav Huna commented to Rav, why are you concerned just because the lechi that the Eruv committee put up fell down? You still have that tree there. Loi sovel amar lismaicha dikla. Don't you hold that you could rely on the dekel to also be considered a lechi? Amar, Rav said, Rav Huna, am I actually hearing that right? I can't believe what you're saying. Domi haimer abanon, you sound like command le parsha and sheshmaitza, like you never went to cheder. You sound like you missed the boat. You don't know the basics of Hilchos Shabbos. Misam chinalei. How could I possibly misam chinalei me'esma? Did we were we relying on this tree from yesterday? Of course not. We had our own lechi that we put up. So since we weren't relying on it from yesterday, of course it would not be a good lechi. So how could you, Rav Huna, even suggest that should be a good lechi? So let's analyze Rav's words. Rav seems to say that the only reason why he couldn't rely on this tree was Tamid Leisham Chinan. It's because he says we didn't rely on it from yesterday. Hasam Chinan, what if on Erev Shabbos they designated this tree as being the lechi? Have a lechi, it would be a good lechi. Well, doesn't that indicate that Rav is paskening like Abyei? Zok Gemara, maybe even further, maybe Rav is not addressing the machloikis of Abyei and Rava. Now, we learned earlier, the Gemara told us, that the machloikis of Abyei and Rava is only in a case where you're relying on it from yesterday. But in the case where you didn't rely on it from yesterday, everybody agrees that it wouldn't be good. Here the Gemara wants to say, maybe not. Lema Abyei v'Rava b'daloisam chinin alai pligi. Maybe Abyei and Rava are arguing when you didn't rely on it from yesterday. Hasam chinin alai have a lechi. But if you relied on it from yesterday, even Rava would agree it's a lechi. And therefore, Rav is not paskening like Abyei. Rav is paskening like Rava. So that's not the case. I can prove to you that the Machlokes Abyei and Rava was in a case that's identical to this case that Rav commented on. How do I know that? Because the Hu Barka, the Abyei Bar Chovu, there was a porch that was in the home of Bar Chovu. Now the porch has to be held up with posts. The outer edges of the porch were supported by posts that went to the ground. And the way the way it was laid out was the post that held up the porch happened to have come down right in the spot where it could act as a perfect lechi for someone else's movie. In those days, I guess, I don't know how property rights work, but if I wanted to support my porch, I was hanging over your property, I can just put a post right down, smack in the middle of the entranceway to your movie and say, sorry, pal, I need the post there. But in my it worked out in a place where it could have acted as a lechi. And all the years, Abyei and Rava argued about it, whether or not this is a good lechi that could be relied on. Now, clearly, that lechi was there for years, so it was there before most of the Shabbos that they disagreed with. So you see clearly that the machlokes of Abyei and Rava is only in the case if you're samchin ala me'esma. Rava said it's not a good lechi. Abyei said it's a good lechi. And Rav himself said that if it was from Chinul Esmol, I would have relied on it. So you see, Rav is paskening like Abyei, and in fact, we pasken like Abyei by Yal Kagam, and in this case, it's the Lechi or Imid Me'elov. We pasken like Abyei that it's a good Lechi. Now, that's only if it's Chinul Esmol. If it's Lois Chinul Esmol, even Abyei would hold it's not good. So let me ask you a question: What would happen? What would happen in an Erev if the telephone wire? We have a lot of tzuras of Pesach in our Erev. So we have two posts. Often you see we put a little lechi up along a telephone post and it lines up to a wire above. What happens if on Shabbos the wire that we're relying on gets damaged? It falls down. But there's another wire that also would work, but that's not the wire that we were relying on before Shabbos. So in other words, it's exactly this case. It's loisam chinul esmol. There was a wire there, but it was loisam chinul esmol. Would you be able to carry on that wire? Based on the fact that there's that wire, or do they have to run around the city telling everybody that the Erev is down? So based on the Prima Godim, the poskim hold that Avada you're allowed to carry. Because this concept of some chinul esmol, which is required, it's only required for a lechi, because everybody agrees, even Abyei holds lechis mishum mechitza, there is an element of heker involved. And therefore, Abyei agrees that if it was losam chinul esmol, for sure that's not a good heker, and therefore it's not good for a lechi. But when we're talking about a tzuras of Pesach that we use the telephone wires for, that's not a lechi. That's not a heker. That's a tzuras of Pesach. That's to build a wall, so to speak. And there you're allowed to be soymech. Most poskim can hold that you're allowed to be soymech on a koira, which is the horizontal piece that goes across, so even though your wire that you were planning to use for the Erev, that designated wire might have been damaged, if there's a secondary wire there that would serve the same purpose, even though it's not what we were relying on as part of the Erev before Shabbos, you could still be makel, according to many poskim, to rely on that wire.
Yosy,
Yes.
just to clarify, so you're saying to be samech with the lechi.
By the way, I just want to add, that's called getting in under the wire.
No, we still have another half an hour. So with the left, to be samech with the lechi, you can be samech on two things at the same time.
I guess
We're
so.
talking about the decal. So
Like
you're
a
saying
primary
decal.
and a secondary. That's right.
Yeah.
You could have backups.
Okay.
Called contingencies. Yeah. Zog to Gemara weiter. B'chol oisin lechin. You're allowed to make a lechi out of anything that you want. Afilu b'davar sheyesh baruch chaim. Even a live animal. For Abyei oisin. Abyei holds you cannot make it out of a davar sheyesh baruch chaim. U'metama mishum goyel. Also, it's metama mishum goyel, meaning a live animal, if it's used to cover over a caver, the halacha is, Rashi tells us, that the cover of a caver is metama mishum tumas meis, even after you took it off. So if you used a behema, to be the cover of a caver, it's non-conventional, it would become tummy, and it would take on its own independent tumah. Reb Meir holds that a Baal Chai does not work that way. So Zog to Gemara for Reb Yosy Glili Aimer, I'm sorry, for Reb Meir Matar. So when it comes to Baal Chaim, the Tanakama holds that it works for everything. It works for a lechi and it works for a goylel. Reb Meir holds no, a behemoth does not work for a lechi and it doesn't take on tumah by a goylel. And Rashi tells us why does Reb Meir hold that a Baal Chai cannot be a wall, it cannot be a goylel. So in Sukkah, Rashi says, Mishum de Kasavar called mechitza ha'omedes beruach chaim ein mechitza. If there's a mechitza that's only held up because of the spirit of life, that's not good. It has to be a structurally sound thing that's not relying on a neshama to keep it in place. Now here's my favorite part. The koisen of gitei nashim. You're also allowed to write gitei nashim on animals. So everybody agrees so far that you're allowed to write gitei nashim on an animal. Rabbi Yosy basically holds it's possible. So I'm thinking, if you're allowed to write a get on an animal, I can see how a husband can get back at his wife. Let's say his wife is terrified of dogs. He'll write the get on the dog and say, "Here, take it." And now she'll have to deal with her fear of dogs in order to accept the get. Zok to the more weiter. Tanya Rabban, Tanya, Rabbi Omer, called over Sheish Baruch Chaim, Ein Oishin Oisoi, anything that has life to it, you can't make it into Lo Doifin L'Sukkah, V'Lo Lechi L'Mavui, and Lo Pasan L'Birois, you can't use it for the encore, for the Enroute station, V'Lo Goylo L'Kever, and it doesn't take on Toma, even if you make it into a Goylo. That's what Rashi says. It's not a discussion if you're allowed to use it. It's Kloimer Im Osoi Goylo, Ein Shem Goylo Chalalov L'Tameh. So even though you want to make it into the cover of a caver, it doesn't take on that function, Lagabe Hilchos Tuma, and it won't be Tuma. Zok to Gemara Vayter. Mishum B'Yeshach Lili Amar, Af Ein Koshon Olav Gitei Noshem. You're not even allowed to write Gitei Noshem on an animal. My time of Yeshach Lili. What is this for? Yeshach Lili. The Tanya. It says the Chos of Law Sefer Krisus. So let's look at the pasuk because the Gemara is going to dissect it now. So it says in the pasuk, Yikach Isha Uva Allah. He wants to get rid of his wife. So the chos of law, sefer krisis, he has to write for her a sefer krisis. So we're analyzing the chos of law, sefer krisis. The Gemara is going to drill down at what we learned from all these words. So it says sefer, as in sefer krisis. In liela sefer, I would think it has to be a sefer with klaf done properly. Minayin l'rabbi's called over. How do I know I can write the get on any object, on any surface? Talmud Lomer, the chos of law, mikol makom. Since there's a chos of law, it says that anything would be good. In fact, Ilmara, imkein mata beloimer sefer. If you could write it anywhere, so why did it say sefer krisus? It's just the chos of law, krisus, v'nasam b'yada. Why does it say sefer? Sefer has that connotation that it has to be written on something special. So tomorrow loimelach, that it does have to be written on something special. Ma sefer davar she'ein beruach chaim, just like a sefer, a klaf has no life to it, ve'ein oichel, and it's not itself food. Av kol davar she'ein beruach chaim ve'ein oichel. So you can't write a get on an animal, you can't write it on a piece of lettuce because that's something that's food. For Rabbanan will hold you could write a get on an animal. What do they do with the sefer? So tomorrow miksiv ba sefer, it says sefer ksiv. It just says v'chosov lo sefer krisis. It doesn't say you should write it ba sefer. So therefore, he says that all it means is l'sfiris dvarim ba'al mahudasa. It just means you're writing stuff on it, but it doesn't mean to designate some standard of what it has to be written on. V'rabbanan.
Yosy, just a quick question. Did I miss this? But isn't the lechi the problem if I write it on a dog, that the dog is going to move and I won't have a lechi anymore? Why isn't that?
No, we're talking about a get here.
Yeah, I know you're talking about a get, but you're talking. Let's say a doifin l'sukkah. You talked about all the other things.
You have to.
Is it going to get up and run away?
Yeah.
Why isn't that the issue?
Well, no, because if it's not an issue, if you want to build your sukkah in such a way where you have to have restraints on the animals, that's your business.
The
Mishnah's not saying it's a good idea. The Mishnah's just asking whether or not it's valid.
Yeah, but also what about the dog? She's going to have to prove the ksuba. The dog's going to run away. Isn't that the logical reason why you can't write it on a piece of paper? Well, you know what? I can't write it on an animal. Of course you can't write animal. Well, how am I going to deposit in my safety deposit box or put in my filing cabinet a dog?
No, it has a built-in guard dog to it.
So I have to chain the dog the whole time how does she come to collect her ksuba? That's what I want to know, if the dog can potentially run away.
She'll have to hold on to that dog to prove that.
So the Torah is telling me safer to exclude dog. That's the limud, to write it on a living animal.
That's exactly how Rabbi Yosy is learning.
Okay, I know that's what the Gemara is, but there's no.
Basically, the Rabbanan actually learn that Rabbi Yosy holds this possible. Rabbi Yosy holds that it says safer to tell you they can't put it on a dog, but Rabbanan hold you would be able to. Rabbanan said you could actually write your get on a dog and then give it to your wife who's afraid of dogs.
Or if the husband is afraid of dogs, Yosy.
I try not to talk about that because when I go walking with my wife, I'm like 4 times her size, and a dog comes, I'm hiding behind her. It's one of the funniest scenes. Okay. Rabbanan, miksiv b'sefer. It doesn't mean you have to write it in a sefer, which would then indicate, in fact, that which would in fact indicate that there has to be those restrictions. Sefer ksiv, it says sefer, which means that you're just writing something. Bas sefer, Rashi tells us, would indicate you have to write it on something that has certain standards to it. It doesn't say it, just says the chosavla sefer krisos, which don't indicate that. It's just l'sfiris dvarim ba'almu to also l'sfiris dvarim ba'almu also. You have to write the text, whatever the syntax is, whatever the nusach is, you have to write it. But there's no restriction as to what you could write it on. In fact, tomorrow Rabban v'hai v'chos of law ma darshibei. It does say v'chos of law, and Rashi explains, given the sefer lav klaf mashma. Since you Rabbanan are learning that the sefer is not a klaf, you can even write it on an animal. Memela halei kavale klaf uv'chol over mashma. You could write on anything. V'lomer leila michtav v'kosov the rabbis called over. The chos of law seems to say you can write it in any way you want. I don't need that, because once I have no standards as to what it has to be written on, then it should have just said v'nosan l'sefer krisos. There was no reason for the Torah to describe the writing of it, because it seems like there's no standards. The whole standard is what has to be written, but upon what it is written, the medium that it's written on, there are no standards for. So it should have just said v'nosan l'sefer krisos. Why does it say the chos of law?
So I could write it on her hand. Right? You know, the old days we used to write on as kids, we wrote things on hand. So I can.
I'm not sure if you could write it on her hand, because you have to write it on something that's yours and then give it to her. I'm not sure if her hand is yours.
Well, I asked for
unless
her
you tell
hand
her
in
before I
marriage.
divorce you, can you give me a hand?
Well, you asked for her hand in marriage, didn't you?
So now you're giving it back.
That's right.
Very good, very good. So look for upon high v'chos of law. Madar shibei. So humi boile the chsiva miskareshes the any miskareshes bekesef. Oh, how many people would wish this was true? You could just get rid of her without writing a get. You don't need to give her any money. Zakt Gemara. I might have thought hoyel v'ishkish litzia le'avaya. Since there's a hekesh between taking a woman when you marry her to when you're divorcing her. Mahavaya bekesef, I would have thought, just like one of the methods of marrying a woman, of taking a wife, is with kinyan kesef. Af yitzi bekesef, so gerushin should work with kesef as well. Kamash malon, that it does not work. Since he uses the v'chos of law to tell you that it has to be written with standards, so how does he know this halacha that kesef does not work for a get? So tomorrow nafkalei means sefer krisos. He learns it out of the word sefer krisos to teach you that sefer karsa ve'ein davar acher karsa. Nothing else besides a get will work to reject a wife. V'rabbanon high sefer krisos v'boilei. What is the rabbanon going to do with this extra sefer krisos that he's not darshaning for anything, because he learns that kesef doesn't work from the chos of law. So he learns to teach us that when you give a wife a get, the get has to be a complete severance. It cannot be a get that has strings attached, because then he's not completely cut off from her. What does that mean? Let's say someone says, I'm going to give you this get, but you have to make a promise that you're never going to drink wine. So that means he's still controlling her. Even after he divorced her, he's still trying to control her. There's still that connection. Or they should never go to your father's home. And Tosfos asks, your father's eventually going to die. So Tosfos says it means your father's household. It means you can never go to your family. I'll divorce you, but you can never go to your family, which means she's in a way tied to him for the rest of her life in order to give the get validity. Ein zekrisus. That's not a kosher get. A get is something that ends completely, like kol shloshim yoim. If he says, I'll give you a get if you don't drink wine for 30 days, or if you don't go visit your family for 30 days, that is a krisus, because at the end of those 30 days, she's completely severed from him. And that's what he learns out of Sefer Krisus, Dovar Karish Lebeinoy Lebeinoy. What about Rabbi Yosy Glili? He used that to tell you that you cannot give a get with money. So he learned this halacha of Dovar Karish Nafkalei Mikaris Krisus. It says Sefer Krisus. It could have said Sefer Kares. And the fact that the Torah used the word Krisus rather than Kares, that teaches you that the get has to be creating a complete severance. For Rabbanan Karish Krisus Laidarshi, the Rabbanan know the fact that the Torah used the word Krisus doesn't teach anything. We cannot extract any information from that. So at the end of the day, we have a couple of interesting halachas that come out of here. We have the shaila of whether or not you could write a get on anything at all. It's unrestricted what you could write it on or not. Rabbi Yosy holds it's restricted because you learn it out of Sefer. The Rabbanan hold you don't learn anything from Sefer. And because of that, there's fallout with a whole bunch of other different drushes. And one shaila is, how do you know that you cannot give a wife a get without writing it? Rather, you should give her money. How do you know money doesn't work? So there the shaila is where you learn it from. Either you learn it from the cost of law, according to Rabbanan, and according to Rabbi Yosy, you learn it from Sefer Krisus, that Sefer Kosher, Ve'indov Acha Karsa. And then the other shaila that comes out of here is that by a get, it has to be a complete severance. How do you know the complete severance? So Rabbi Yosy learns it out of Dover Akoris Beinoy Levenot. He learns that from Krisus. Rabbi Yosy uses the word Koris Krisus, since it doesn't say the word Koris, it says the word Krisus. You know that from there. They're both hold that that's not a raya. So those are the three halachas. If you're restricted upon what you can write your get on, a get is only a get. You can't give money to get rid of your wife, and your get has to be a dover koris l'beinah l'beinah. It cannot have any strings attached. Zok the heilige Mishnah weiter. Sheyora shechansa bebika. You were on a caravan, and the caravan stopped to rest on Shabbos. And where did they stop? In a bika, in a valley. The kifua klei behema metaltalin. I'm sorry, klei behema. And what they did was they needed to make a wall, a perimeter, to create a Rosh Hashanah. They had to make a camp. So they took all of the different utensils that they had, and they built a makeshift wall around their camp. So the halach is metaltalin b'soicha. You're allowed to carry in that makeshift perimeter because it's a wall for purposes of creating Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. Whatever they piled up to make this makeshift wall has to be at least 10 tefachim high. That's rule number one. Rule number two, and there should be more wall than binyan. So let's say the total linear feet of this perimeter was 100. At least 50 feet of it has to be wall, and 50 feet of it could be open space. And there's one more rule, that the maximum open space allowed between blocked area is 10 amas. Because it acts as a wall. So basically, very simple. You need to set up a camp. You just have to have three rules in mind. A, make sure your wall is 10 tefachim high. B, make sure that at least 50% of the linear feet of the wall has wall there that's not open space. And three, make sure that there's no open space that's bigger than 10 amas.
So Yosy, the kalim that you're using, there can be like gaps in the kalim
Saddles.
Yeah, but I'm saying you're piling that stuff up, so there's air gaps in between them. So it's not a solid wall, obviously. So that's
right. That probably is not a problem. You can say love it for those, probably.
Okay.
Itmar, paritz ka'imid. What is it? What would happen if it's exactly the same amount? In other words, there's 100 linear feet, exactly 50 linear feet of wall, and there's exactly 50 linear feet of open space. Papa Amar Mutter, he says that's a good wall. From the Mishu Amar, also it's not a good wall. Papa Amar Mutter, Hachi Agmir Rechman L'Moshe. We know mechitzos are all halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and this is how it came down. That loy sefer truba. Make sure your perimeter is not open roiv, which means 50-50 would be good. This is how the halacha l'Moshe Sinai came down. Gedor ruba. Make sure that most of it is enclosed. Tanan, so now we need to know what's halacha. Tanan, if you look to our Mishnah says the only problem would be if it's more porous than binyan. Mashma that 50-50. From our Mishnah alone, it's mashma that 50-50. Haki binyan will be mutter. So this is a proof. This is proof to our papa. So to Gemara, loitema haki binyan mutter. That's not how you should be a daik from a Mishnah. Elaino in binyan yeser ala pirtza mutter. If there's more wall than open space, it's mutter. Avol kevinyan my usher, that would be usher. Are you saying that it would be usher? Ihachi listening lo yehu pirtza kevinyan. Let the Mishnah be more accurate in its wording. And it shouldn't have said v'lo you purchase yiser salabinyan. It should have said v'lo you purchase kibinyan, because even 50-50 is no good. So tomorrow kasha, no, I'm not worried about that. Panaraban, hamakaris ukasei b'shpudin oberuchas amita. What if you made a ceiling for your sukkah with posel eschach, and you used either rods or bedposts, items that are not kosher eschach, but you left gaps in between them that you filled with schach. So if the space in between the posel schach is at least equal to the space that the posel schach actually covered, then kshera. In other words, if exactly 50% of the covering is kosher schach, not 51%, if exactly 50%, it will be good. So this would be a right or papa that 50% is enough. So how do you test to make sure that there's 50-50 space? I have rods lined up. How do I know if the space in between the rods is exactly the same space as the rod? Because I take another rod and I put it in between them and I take it out. If you have enough space in between two rods to take a third rod and put it in and take it out, you have to leave a drop extra space. Otherwise, they would bang into each other as you take them in and out. So that's what the brisa means. That's what the brisa means in Yesh Revach B'nei Kamoison. It means there's a drop more. So therefore, it's not Shrener of Huna. And why would you say that? Why don't you say that it's exactly the same amount? Who said you have more? Ravami b'madiv. It's speaking here where you did put a lot more schach. If you put a lot more schach, only that's why it's going to be mutter. Otherwise, it wouldn't be mutter. Rav Amar im hoyunasun arav nois neshesi. If the posel schach were going in one direction, put the kosher schach in the opposite direction, and this way there'll be a lot more kosher schach than there is posel schach. Even though there's posel schach underneath it, the Gemara Sukkah already explains that it becomes bottle. So moyu nois ne'erev nois neshesi, shesi nois ne'erev. You put it in a different direction, and therefore you'll definitely have more kosher schach than posel schach. And therefore, from all these cases so far, you do not have a raya, not Rav Sheshes, not Rav Huna. So we still have our machlokes standing. Is paritz ka'omed going to be a good mechitza, or will it not be a good mechitza? And I guess we could stop here.
But also, there's shkoyach. First of all, there's a huge difference between a mechitza wall and
a schach. That's right. So it must be, and it's a little bit shverlich because the shaila there was how did halacha l'moshe Mishidei come down?
Come down,
right?
exact or more, yeah.
So he must learn that if you find paritz ka'omed is good here, it must be good there, even though the mice it's not exactly the same shaila.
Right, because if you had 50% of your schach missing, it would be a posel sukkah.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And
here we're not saying missing; it's saying it's posel schach,
Posel.
which is different than missing schach.
That's right. That's right.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach to you.
Shkoyach.
Morning, Yosy.